From Democracy Now!, this is Breaking with Convention.
My fellow Americans, tonight, with a heart full of gratitude and boundless optimism, I profoundly accept this nomination for President of the United States.
Speaking on the South Lawn of the White House, President Trump officially becomes the Republican presidential nominee. In a speech filled with lies and falsehoods, Trump repeatedly attacked his rival Joe Biden and the Democratic Party.
If the Democrat Party wants to stand with anarchists, agitators, rioters, looters, and flag burners, that is up to them. But I, as your president, will not be a part of it. The Republican Party will remain the voice of the patriotic heroes who keep America safe and salute the American flag.
Trump spoke before a crowd of about 1,000. Most of them unmasked, the same number of people, of Americans who die of coronavirus roughly every day. We'll air excerpts of Trump's speech and speak to the historian Rick Perlstein. But first, we go to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where the ACLU is calling for the immediate resignation of the Kenosha police chief and sheriff following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. And we go to the Gulf Coast, where Hurricane Laura slammed ashore Wednesday as a Category 4 hurricane. We'll speak to Goldman Environmental Prize winner Hilton Kelly, who evacuated from his home in Port Arthur, Texas, home to the largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump formally accepted the Republican Party's nomination Thursday night before a crowd of about 1,500 people on the South Lawn of the White House. In defiance of social distancing rules, attendees sat shoulder to shoulder with few people wearing masks. Trump spoke as the U.S. death toll from the coronavirus topped 180,000, by far the highest total in the world. During his speech, Trump defended his administration's handling of the pandemic.
We are delivering life-saving therapies and will produce a vaccine before the end of the year, or maybe even sooner. We will defeat the virus, end the pandemic, and emerge stronger than ever before.
During his acceptance speech, Trump repeatedly attacked his rival Joe Biden, claiming he was a threat to the American dream. CNN reported Trump's speech included at least 20 lies and misleading statements. We'll have more on Trump's speech later in the broadcast. The United States reported more than 1,100 new coronavirus deaths Thursday as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention warned the U.S. is on track to record its 200,000th death from COVID-19 by the fourth week of September. Public health officials say the true U.S. death toll likely passed that grim milestone weeks ago. In Arizona, two sisters from the Navajo Nation, Cheryl and Corinna Thin, have died of COVID-19 just weeks apart, age 40 and 44. Both sisters worked as frontline healthcare workers. They're among nearly 500 people to die of the coronavirus on the Navajo Nation, which has one of the highest infection rates in the world. Meanwhile, the Daily Beast reports the University of Alabama ordered faculty members to remain silent about students who test positive for the virus, arguing alerting their classmates would violate federal privacy rules. In an email, the professors were admonished, quote, "Do not tell the rest of the class," with the word "not" underlined. In Louisiana, at least 6 people were killed after Hurricane Laura came ashore Thursday as one of the strongest recorded storms ever to hit the United States. The Category 4 hurricane failed to produce the massive storm surge feared by forecasters, but brought fierce winds of up to 150 miles per hour that overturned vehicles, ripped the roofs off houses, shattered the glass windows of a 22-story office tower. The storm triggered a massive fire at a chemical plant near Lake Charles that sent plumes of black smoke and poisonous chlorine gas billowing across Interstate 10. Local residents who hadn't already evacuated were ordered to shelter in place with their windows and doors closed. The hurricane also toppled a century-old monument to a Confederate soldier on the lawn of a courthouse in Lake Charles. Just 2 weeks ago, local officials voted to keep the statue in place amidst nationwide protests demanding the removal of monuments to slavery and racism. In Wisconsin, the father of Jacob Blake said Thursday his son is being handcuffed to a hospital bed in Milwaukee, where he remains paralyzed from the waist down after he was shot 7 times at point-blank range in the back Sunday by a white Kenosha police officer. Jacob Blake Sr. said it remains unclear what charges, if any, his son faces. Jacob Blake is African-American. The white officer who shot him, Rustin Chesky, has been placed on administrative leave and has not been fired or charged with a crime. Protesters marched through Kenosha for a 5th straight night Thursday to demand Chesky's arrest, as Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers said Alabama, Arizona, and Michigan were sending more National Guard troops to patrol the streets. Meanwhile, Kenosha County prosecutors Thursday brought 6 charges against Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old white militia member who was filmed killing 2 people and injuring a third with an AR-15 assault rifle during protests in Kenosha Tuesday. If convicted of first-degree intentional homicide and first-degree reckless homicide, Rittenhouse faces up to life in prison. This comes as the American Civil Liberties Union is demanding the immediate resignation of Kenosha Police Chief Daniel Miskinis, who on Wednesday blamed curfew violators and not militia members for Tuesday's deadly violence. The ACLU is also demanding Kenosha County Sheriff David Beth step down as video resurfaced of racist remarks he made in 2018. During a news conference that year, Beth described black people accused of shoplifting and crashing a stolen car as, quote, garbage people that fill our communities that are a cancer to our society, unquote.
Let's put them in jail. Let's stop them from truly, at least some of these males, going out and getting 10 other women pregnant and having small children. Let's put them away. We put them away for the rest of their lives so that the rest of us can be better.
Kenosha County Sheriff David Beth. In a statement, the ACLU said the actions of the sheriff and police chief, quote, uphold and defend white supremacy while demonizing people who were murdered for exercising their First Amendment rights and speaking out against police violence. After headlines, we'll speak with the head of the ACLU Wisconsin. In North Carolina, Ronnie Long, an African-American who spent 44 years behind bars for a crime he didn't commit, walked out of the Correctional Institute, the prison, Thursday, a free man. In 1976, Long was convicted of rape by an all-white jury and sentenced to 80 years in prison. In 2015, his lawyers learned investigators had withheld exculpatory evidence proving his innocence, while witnesses for the state committed perjury at his trial. It would take several more years and a ruling by the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals for Long to win his freedom. In sports news, professional athletes continued work stoppages Thursday to protest police violence and racial injustice. At the start of the Mets-Marlins game here in New York yesterday, both teams walked onto the field and stood silently for 42 seconds in honor of the first African-American player in the major leagues, Jackie Robinson. Then they walked off the field, refusing to play, leaving a Black Lives Matter T-shirt draped over home plate. In total, 7 Major League Baseball games were postponed Thursday. The NBA, the Women's WNBA, and the National Hockey League also postponed games, and 9 NFL teams canceled practices amidst player protests. In Washington, D.C., tens of thousands of protesters from across the country are expected to march on the Lincoln Memorial today, joining ongoing demands for criminal justice reform and outcry against police brutality and racial violence. Participants will include the Reverend Al Sharpton, the families of George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner, Ahmaud Arbery, Jacob Blake, and Breonna Taylor. Today marks 57 years since Martin Luther King Jr. gave his 1963 I Have a Dream speech in front of the Lincoln Memorial, as well as the anniversary of the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till, who was lynched by a white mob on August 28, 1955, in Money, Mississippi. Meanwhile, the Movement for Black Lives is hosting the Black National Convention tonight, a virtual event showcasing the power and resistance of the Black Lives Matter movement. The Labor Department reports another 1 million U.S. workers filed initial unemployment claims over the last week, the 23rd straight week in a row that jobless claims shattered their pre-pandemic record. Meanwhile, the S&P 500 stock market index closed at an all-time record high on Thursday, and Forbes reports Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos has become the first person ever to amass a $200 billion fortune. In Japan, Shinzo Abe said Friday he's resigning as prime minister due to poor health. Over nearly 8 years in office, he remained pro-nuclear despite the 2011 Fukushima nuclear meltdown following the earthquake and tsunami. Throughout his career, Abe tried unsuccessfully to do away with Article 9 of Japan's constitution, which renounces war and bars Japan from using or threatening to use military force. In Coolidge, Arizona, members of several indigenous communities, including the Tohono O'odham Nation, on Wednesday temporarily blocked access to a site where 30-foot steel barriers are assembled for use in the construction of Trump's border wall.
No border, no wall. No border, no wall. No border, no wall.
The tribal members were non-violently protesting the ongoing desecration of sacred sites on ancestral indigenous land by construction crews building the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. In related news, the New York Times reports top officials with the Department of Homeland Security in 2018 suggested deploying to the U.S.-Mexico border a so-called heat ray designed by the military to make people's skin feel as if it's burning when they're within range of the weapon's invisible beams. The disturbing suggestion reportedly came 2 weeks before the 2018 midterm election as President Trump pushed for extreme action to stop a caravan of thousands of refugees, mostly from Central America, coming to the United States. In more immigration news, refugee rights groups have filed a complaint with the Department of Homeland Security's Office of Civil Rights demanding the agency investigate violent and discriminatory practices against black refugees imprisoned at the Pine Prairie ICE Processing Center in Louisiana. 48 Cameroonian refugees held at the jail have launched another hunger strike protesting their indefinite detention, inhumane conditions during the pandemic, and racist treatment by prison staff. They've been reportedly retaliated against with solitary confinement after demanding their asylum claims be heard. This is video testimony of the Cameroonian hunger strikers published online in June.
But the judge keeps saying that we are criminals. He doesn't believe what we are saying.
So we're pleading with the people outside, all the NGOs, Southern Poverty, or the Congress people, please, the United States as a whole. We beg you people to help us in here. Help us in here. We are dying. We are dying for real.
In Texas, the body of a missing soldier stationed at the Fort Hood Army base was found Tuesday night hanging from a tree some 30 miles from the base. 23-year-old Elder Fernandez went missing last week. He'd recently reported being sexually abused at the base and was working with an investigative unit. Last month, the remains of 20-year-old Fort Hood soldier Vanessa Guillen were also discovered near the base after she was bludgeoned to death and disappeared in April by a soldier Guillen had accused of sexually harassing her. Fernandez is the 13th Fort Hood soldier to have disappeared or been killed this year. And a U.S. District Court judge in Washington, D.C. has halted today's planned execution of Keith Dwayne Nelson, ruling the federal government failed to get a legally required prescription for the lethal injection drug pentobarbital. The ruling came just 1 day after the only Native American on federal death row, 38-year-old Lesmond Mitchell, was put to death using the same drug over the objections of the Navajo Nation. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. We begin today's show in Wisconsin, where the father of Jacob Blake said Thursday his son is being handcuffed to a hospital bed in Milwaukee, where he remains paralyzed from the waist down after he was shot 7 times at point-blank range in the back by a Kenosha police officer. Jacob Blake Sr. said it remains unclear what charges, if any, his son faces. Jacob Blake is African-American. The white officer who shot him, Rustin Chesky, has been placed on administrative leave, has not been fired or charged with a crime. Protesters marched through Kenosha for a 5th straight night Thursday to demand Chesky's arrest, as Wisconsin Governor Tony Evers said Alabama, Arizona, and Michigan were sending more National Guard troops to patrol the streets. This all comes as Kenosha County prosecutors have brought 6 charges against Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old militia member who was filmed killing 2 people and injuring a 3rd with an AR-15 assault rifle during protests in Kenosha Tuesday. If convicted on charges of first-degree intentional homicide and first-degree reckless homicide, Rittenhouse faces up to life in prison. Calls are growing for the Kenosha police chief and county sheriff to resign after police allowed Rittenhouse to leave the scene after gunning down protesters. Videos surfaced of Kenosha police offering militia members water early in the night and expressing their support for them. them. The American Civil Liberties Union also condemned Police Chief Daniel Miskinis' comments blaming protesters for the deadly assault at a news conference on Wednesday.
The curfew's in place to protect. Had persons not been out involved in violation of that, perhaps the situation that unfolded would not have happened.
Meanwhile, a damning video of Kenosha County Sheriff David Beth making racist comments has surfaced from a 2018 news conference. Beth described 5 people of color accused of shoplifting and crashing a stolen car as, quote, garbage people that fill our communities that are a cancer to our society.
Let's put them in jail. Let's stop them from truly, at least some of these males going out and getting 10 other women pregnant and having small children. Let's put them away. At some point, we have to stop being politically correct. And I don't care what race, I don't care how old they are. If there's a threshold that they cross, these people have to be warehoused. No recreational time. In this country, in this community, in this state, we have to get to the point that we no longer will put up with the garbage people that fill our communities, that are our cancer to our society.
For more, we go to Milwaukee, where we're joined by Chris Ott, Executive Director of the ACLU Wisconsin. He's calling for Kenosha Sheriff David Beth and Police Chief Daniel Miskinis to resign. We welcome you to Democracy Now! Can you lay out the latest, what your demands are, and why?
Thank you, Amy. We've, of course, seen this terrible pattern of excessive and deadly police force against Black men, women, and other people of color in particular, and then a really heavy-handed response to the understandable reaction and concern from the communities. And when police and law enforcement go into communities in this militarized way, this heavy-handed way, it just inflames tensions, makes things worse, and creates dangerous new situations. Unfortunately, that's what we've seen playing out in Kenosha all week, and that is why the ACLU has called for the resignations of the county sheriff and the police chief for their leading role in what's happened.
What's astounding is that these news conferences we've seen on Wednesday and then again on Thursday, they always lead with the protests and the protesters. You have the comments about the protesters, being responsible for the murders on Tuesday night. That's just extremely significant, to say the least. Rarely talking about the police shooting of Jacob Blake, not to mention those murders.
Right. It's really troubling to hear, after seeing, the terrible events that unfolded all week, starting with the shooting of Mr. Blake, but then the killings on Tuesday night, to see law enforcement officials effectively blaming people for their own deaths is just outrageous and is making the situation even worse than it is.
So what is happening with Jacob Blake right now, laying paralyzed in a hospital bed in Milwaukee, but handcuffed?
That's what I've heard. I've seen the same reports that you have, and if that is true, then that is just adding a terrible insult to the terrible injuries that Mr. Blake sustained after being shot 7 times in front of his children on Sunday.
And the officer, the white police officer, who shot Jacob Blake 7 times point blank in the back?
Well, we need a much stronger response than we've seen so far. We need justice in this case and so many others. And one of the things that's really troubling, going back to the fatal shootings on Tuesday night, is the stark contrast between the way that Mr. Blake was treated on Sunday, effectively given no benefit of the doubt, and yet on the streets of Kenosha on Tuesday night, we saw Sheriff Beth's deputies not only fraternizing with white supremacist counter-protesters, but apparently, even though people were shouting that that they had seen Kyle Rittenhouse shoot 2 people, they let him go. The contrast there is just really stark, and that just shows the problem that we have all across the country.
So the ACLU is calling for the resignations of the sheriff and the police chief. What has been the response?
I don't know that we have seen a response from them so far, but we did this following the lead of organizers on the ground. We are working with people in the community on this, in consultation with people in the community, and we need to see this kind of response that we've seen in Kenosha needs to end, and we need to see these resignations as a part of making that happen.
Well, Chris, I want to thank you for being with us, Executive Director of the ACLU Wisconsin. And we're going to find out now why the police department is not investigating itself. Jacob Blake is not the first victim of a controversial police shooting in Kenosha. Go back some years, on November 9th, 2004, before police body cameras were in use in the United States, Kenosha police killed a white 21-year-old young man named Michael Bell in front of his mother and sister in their driveway. The incident began when Kenosha police stopped Michael Bell in his car in front of his parents' home. Bell dashed up the driveway, was grabbed from behind by two Kenosha officers who pinned him against a parked car. While a third officer kept his mother and sister several yards away, a fourth Kenosha police officer ran up, pulled out his weapon, placed it against Bell's head, and pulled the trigger, killing him. The Kenosha Police Department conducted its own review of the incident and within 2 days completely exonerated the officers. Bell's father, Michael Bell Sr., commissioned an independent inquiry that found the police account of the incident to be forensically impossible, suggesting a cover-up. The city settled a civil rights lawsuit with the Bells for $1.75 million, most of which was then spent on a campaign to change Wisconsin's law governing how police-involved shootings are investigated. After a decade, in 2014, their campaign succeeded, and then Governor Scott Walker signed the bill into law, making Wisconsin the first state to require outside investigators conduct investigations into police shootings. That's where the Jacob Blake investigation is right now, under the supervision of the Wisconsin Department of Justice, with involvement of the FBI, Wisconsin State Patrol, and Kenosha County Sheriff's Office. For more, we go to Kenosha, where we're joined by Michael Bell's father, Michael Bell Sr., who led the campaign to change the law. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Michael Bell. This must be horrifyingly familiar to you. While you have Jacob Blake laying handcuffed in a hospital bed as a result of being shot by a white police officer 7 times at point-blank range in the back, you must have gone through a lot of déjà vu in the last days with your family. Tell us the story of your son, Michael.
Well, first, thanks, Amy, for having me on your show. I want everybody to know that I am a retired military officer. I was a pilot, and so I'm coming at it from that perspective. I flew combat missions in 3 different conflicts for our country. So when my son first got killed, it was really hard for me to believe that a uniformed person would do that, because everybody that I was associated with would never have done something like that. It was really sad that I didn't even believe my own daughter's version of it. It took me about 10 weeks or so before I understood the truth, just because I was just so hardened as a pro-uniform type of person. My son had come home from a night out with friends. He'd pulled in front of his own home. You can go to michaelbell.info and you can watch the dash cam video. An officer who he had a run-in with just weeks before pulled up. My son was not a perfect angel. He did have a pending DUI. Also, he was a college student and he was employed. And so essentially this officer approached him, and it wasn't even in a nice manner. It was essentially, get back in a car, get back in a car. My son, he worked with the officer. He started moving back to the car. The officer saw somebody in the front seat, and he pulled my son off camera. Then it didn't put him in a car. Very quickly, the officers made some accusations which turned to be false. He accused my son of speeding and running a stop sign, but you can see the dash cam video. And also in the civil rights trial, we negated all those claims. Eventually, my son refused a breathalyzer. An officer went to arrest him. They tased him. You can hear him scream. He ran to the back of the home, and Michael's mother and sister heard the commotion. They ran downstairs, and also a number of other people turned on their porch lights to watch what was going on. And my son was essentially bent over a car, and handcuffed, and an officer screamed, "He has my gun." And an officer arrived on the scene, placed his gun directly to my son's temple. He tried to fire it, but because the slide was disengaged, the gun wouldn't fire, so he put it back to my son's temple a second time, and he fired a deadly shot.
The officer in charge gave him a direct command?
Yes, shoot. And I have to tell you that I have investigators on my team that are retired police officers, and we've later uncovered that the officer who said he has my gun had made an honest mistake. He had backed himself up into a car mirror. The car that was in question here was a Nissan Pulsar and had a very thin driver's side mirror. And it fit perfectly between what was called a jacket gap. In Wisconsin, the winters are kind of cool, and so the holsters are set up in such a way that your gun can remain on the outside of your jacket, and it kind of looks like a hook on the top of a cane. Well, this officer backed into this mirror, and as he twisted, he felt a tugging on his gun, and he immediately called out, "He has my gun," and that's when the problem occurred. Now, I understand as a military officer that types of things like this occur in combat situations that are highly volatile. But the problem that I had was this: is that the Kenosha Police Department covered up the true facts of the case, and in addition to that, those facts are ongoing today, and this investigation is not over with. We are looking to find the truth about my son's case, and that's why we're still pushing it.
So you have the police officer who you believe his holster was pulled. He was up against the driver's side outside mirror. Then you have the police officer who had Michael in a bear hug. And you had this all described because his mother and sister was right there being held back by a fourth officer. And this third officer, you believe, came in between Michael being held in a bear hug over the hood of the car and this officer who thinks Michael has his gun, but in fact, it's the mirror that has his gun. And this officer comes in between them and puts the gun to his head because he's shot in the right side, in the right temple, and pulls the trigger.
That's absolutely correct. And we knew that from early on. And it took us several years to finally catch them. In 2007, under video depositions, my attorney, Patrick Dunphy at Cannon & Dunphy, he allowed all the officers to tell their lies. And after the fourth officer told a lie, Lieutenant Kruger, he handed him a copy of the forensics examiner's report that showed that my son was sat in the right side of the head, and the bullet exited the left side of his head. And then they were caught. And then they turned around and tried to recreate a different version where the officer was placed in the front of the car, and he had to twist my son's head around. I want your listeners to understand that the police in Kenosha had changed their testimony 19 times. Eyewitness testimony never changed once. The officer who killed my son actually changed his testimony 6 times. And so that's the problem that's going on right now here in Kenosha, is that even though we fought for an independent investigation, all that investigation is going to go back to a district attorney who has been ignorant of all the facts of the Michael Bell case. And so I am very worried about whether justice is going to be served in the Jacob Blake case.
So I'm going to talk about that in a second, where this Jacob Blake case is right now, who's doing the investigation. But take us a step further. Michael is killed in 2004. You have your own investigation done, an independent investigation, completely conflicts with the police investigation that exonerated all the officers. Then in 2010, talk about the officer who took his own life.
We settled a civil rights lawsuit on Michael's birthday in 2010, and it is our belief that when I settled the civil rights lawsuit, it was a record lawsuit at the time. I refused to accept a non-disclosure or confidentiality agreement. It was important to me to make sure that Michael's story was told and these facts can continue to come into the public. Well, the city was under such pressure at the time to settle that they accepted under those conditions. And later in the summer, I started taking out billboards along interstates in Wisconsin, and those billboards said, "When police kill, should they investigate themselves?" And word got to the officer that the case was still open. and October 30th of 2010, the officer who mistakenly said that Michael had his gun took his own life. And that's the sad part about it.
Say that again.
That's the sad part about it, is that the officer that hooked his gun on a car mirror took his own life on October 30th, 2010. And I want you listeners to understand that there's tragedy on both sides of this, that the families of officers are grieving, that Officer Eric Straussbaugh's 2 children are growing up without a father. Our family is devastated by this, and that is why I am unrelentingly challenging the current system. And we accomplished the first part of that in 2014 by passing a law that says police cannot investigate themselves after a fatal deadly shooting. And just this week, we're getting ready to introduce new legislation, which is a second part of our journey forward. And I want everybody to remember that I'm a military pilot, and flying jets in combat scenarios is very dangerous. And the way we stay alive is by investigating previous mishaps thoroughly, understanding the true root causes, and then implementing safety recommendations to make sure that it doesn't happen again. I wrote an article, and your listeners can look for it. It's called The Insanity of Finding Fault versus Fixing Cause. And what I did is I took an airplane crash, and I also took a police shooting, and I compared them side by side, and I showed how one changed aviation forever for the better, and the law enforcement side, nothing changed. And that's why we are in this continuing cycle. So in 2007...
So, Michael Bell, I just want to ask, the law you got passed in 2014, and this bears directly on Jake Blake's case, the law you passed took an investigation of an officer-involved shooting out of Kenosha, and the Attorney General of Wisconsin is now in charge of it. But when I watched that news conference on Wednesday, it was then explained that once they do the investigation, maybe it takes, 30 days, they then go to, they send that information back to the DA, and he does like a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Is there enough evidence here to convict? He decides that, the Kenosha DA.
And that's right. And the Kenosha DA has been a thorn to this from the beginning. I mean, you have all this changing testimony. You have forensically impossible facts on my son's case, and the Kenosha DA turns a blind eye to it. And I am very worried that the Kenosha DA is going to do that same thing with Jacob's case. I have been telling everyone that we should be doing like New York and New Jersey. The governor of New York did an executive order that said that all police shootings have to be prosecuted by outside prosecutors. So this case does not need to come back to a DA that has a long-term relationship with both the Sheriff's Department and the Police Department. I'm going to be releasing a video very soon that shows that the DA, Michael Gravely, here in Kenosha, colluded with the police chief to block an investigation into Dennis Miskinnis's department. And so that's one of the things that has to change. We cannot have local police shootings investigated by the local prosecutor whose political base is the families and relatives of the law enforcement officers that he provides cover for.
And finally, as Jacob Blake was shot at point-blank range 7 times in the back with his little kids, 3, 5, and 8, watching in horror in the car. When you learned of this, Michael Bell, your thoughts? And do you know Jacob's family?
I do not know Jacob's family. I learned about it Sunday night. We have a Facebook page, Please for a Change, and people from that Facebook page were just sending me video after video, and sort of during the dinner table, first thing I did is I opened up and watched the video, and I was very appalled by what I seen. But I'm not rendering judgment until the investigation is complete. But one of the things that my eyes were drawn to immediately was the woman that was standing outside the door of the car, jumping up and down, because I know how emotionally traumatic this is to a family member and has to see it. I assure you that even though my son's case was 16 years ago, Michael's mother, Michael's sister, and the eyewitnesses that saw that case are still traumatized by the events of that night.
Well, Michael Bell, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Father of Michael Bell Jr., 21-year-old young man killed by the Kenosha police in 2004. It is his father's efforts that led to the change in the law that took the investigation of an officer-involved shooting out of the hands of the Kenosha police. When we come back, President Trump accepts the Republican presidential nomination again in a speech filled with lies and falsehoods. We'll air excerpts and speak with the historian Rick Perlstein.
Down and resentment, bile in my stomach, feelings of hate and pain behind my eyes, looking at a world that's shaking slightly. My ears are filling with rubbish. I can't fight it. Can't make it work. Hello, world. Hello, world. Walking over barbed wire, sinking in the mire. I heard you singing. You sounded brave, stepping over broken bodies, nor my trembling hands. Don't think of this as blood. I know it is.
The Mekons' Hello, Cruel World, performed by Jim McHugh. This is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump formally accepted the Republican Party's nomination Thursday night before a crowd of about 1,500 people on the South Lawn of the White House. In defiance of social distancing rules, attendees sat shoulder to shoulder. Few wore masks. Trump spoke as the U.S. death toll from the coronavirus neared 180,000, by far the highest total in the world. About the same number of people sat in front of him as die every day in the United States of coronavirus. During his speech, Trump repeatedly defended his administration's handling of the pandemic.
The United States is among the lowest case fatality rates of any major country anywhere in the world. The European Union's case fatality rate is nearly 3 times higher than ours, but you don't hear that. They don't write about that. They don't want to write about that. They don't want you to know those things.
In fact, the U.S. has the highest total death toll in the world. With a little over 4% of the world's population, the U.S. has about 25% of the world's coronavirus deaths. 120 nations have a lower case fatality rate than the United States. CNN reports this was one of the more than 20 false or misleading statements in Trump's acceptance speech. Earlier in the day, Democratic vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris delivered a pre-rebuttal to Trump's speech and attacked his handling of the coronavirus outbreak.
Donald Trump has failed at the most basic and important job of a president of the United States. He failed to protect the American people. Plain and simple. Trump showed that we in the legal profession would call a reckless disregard for the well-being of the American people. A reckless disregard.
During his acceptance speech, President Trump made no reference to the police shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, Wisconsin, or the killing of the 2 protesters in Kenosha by a 17-year-old white militia Trump supporter.
When there is police misconduct, the justice system must hold wrongdoers fully and completely accountable, and it will. But when we can never have a situation where things are going on as they are today, we must never allow mob rule. We can never allow mob rule. In the strongest possible terms, the Republican Party condemns the rioting, looting, arson, and violence we have seen in Democrat-run cities all, like Kenosha, Minneapolis, Portland, Chicago, and New York, and many others, Democrat-run. There is violence and danger in the streets of many Democrat-run cities throughout America.
During her pre-buttal, Kamala Harris directly addressed the police shooting of Jacob Blake and other incidents of police violence.
As Vice President Biden put it, the shots fired at Mr. Blake pierced the soul of our nation. It's sickening to watch. It's all too familiar. People are rightfully angry and exhausted. And after the murders of Breonna and George and Ahmaud and so many others, it's no wonder people are taken to the streets. And I support them. We must always defend peaceful protest and peaceful protesters. We should not confuse them with those looting and committing acts of violence.
During Trump's acceptance speech, he mentioned Joe Biden's name, about 41 times. He attacked him repeatedly, claiming he was a Trojan horse for socialism and a threat to the American dream.
Biden is a Trojan horse for socialism. If Joe Biden doesn't have the strength to stand up to wild-eyed Marxists like Bernie Sanders and his fellow radicals, and there are many, we see them all the time, it's incredible actually, then how is he ever going to stand up for you? He's not. Make no mistake, if you give power to Joe Biden, the radical left will defund police departments all across America. They will pass federal legislation to reduce law enforcement nationwide. They will make every city look like Democrat-run Portland, Oregon. No one will be safe in Biden's America. My administration will always stand with the men and women of law enforcement.
To talk more about President Trump's acceptance speech in the 2020 race, we're joined by historian Rick Perlstein. Over the last 20 years, Perlstein has written 4-volume series on the rise of the modern conservative movement. The final volume, just published, it's titled Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 1980. Welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Rick Perlstein. Can you talk about the tropes, the language that President Trump used last night, but go beyond his speech last night and talk about what you see happening to the Republican Party right now? Would you say last night was just a celebration of white supremacy?
Yeah, I think that that's a very hard conclusion to avoid. Adolf Hitler's chief propagandist, Joseph Goebbels, used to say it's easier to get the public to believe a big lie than a small one. And what he meant was, if you create such a all-encompassing, completely dominating picture of the world that bears no resemblance to reality, people might think that it's inconceivable that that could be false, right? And that's exactly what we've seen this week in the Republican convention. And the idea that this is happening while basically a young man who amounts to a stochastic terrorist, that's basically a person committing political acts of violence, believing to be inspired by the acts and wishes of a leader, has happened, is something that you cannot separate from what we saw on our screens. This young man is an impassioned Trump supporter, an impassioned police supporter. He goes to Trump rallies. He goes online and presents videos, believing himself to be an armed vigilante protecting the nation against these dark and frightening hordes. He comes to Kenosha, and every terrorist believes or claims to believe that they're protecting something, that they're protecting order. This young gentleman goes around with the support of the police, who hand him water from their riot tanks, and he shoots. He's fleeing. People are trying to disarm him, and his first instinct is to shoot another person in the head, acting basically in line with not the things that a white supremacist Nazi writer of pamphlets says, but the things that the president of the United States does. And the picture that we're looking at, of course, bears careful and thoughtful resemblance to the world that the Republican Party made over the last 40 years. But to understand it, we need to go back to the history of strongmen, going back to a Mussolini, going back to a Hitler.
Johns Hopkins University professor Narges Bajogli wrote on Twitter last night, having studied production of propaganda in history and present for years, poring over endless hours dissecting how it works and looking for when it works well, the RNC convention past 3 days has been some of the best produced and most effective propaganda I've seen, she said. Rick Perlstein.
Yeah, I think that it's effective in the sense that it's going to really motivate people who are within this kind of phony worldview, the one in which, the coronavirus is referred to in the past tense, and America's, economy is the most awesome dynamo the world has ever seen. But of course, in order to win, he needs to reach beyond that and, win the majority of electoral votes. But by the same token, I've made an absolute commitment not to talk about the election of Donald Trump and his attempt to retain power only by talking about voters and electoral votes, because he's appealing so adamantly to the kind of people who will take up arms in the streets if he loses. One of the things we need to understand when it comes to the history of authoritarian strongmen is they're so lawless and their janissaries and enablers are so lawless that they know that if they lose, they may well be called to account for their breaking of the laws. And that makes it an absolute desperate imperative that they not lose. And that's when you see the most frightening developments. The idea that you cannot allow elections to stand. That's what we saw in Chile in 1970. They lost an election, and that's when they, bombed the presidential palace, right? That's in 1973 when they bombed the presidential palace, but that's when they seized the generals seized power by force of arms, because they knew that were they to lose, they would be held responsible for the crimes that they'd committed.
So, Rick, I wanted to go back to the Democratic National Convention last week, centering on the voices of anti-Trump Republicans, but sidelining progressive Democrats. I mean, like AOC, for example, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Yes, she spoke for 60 seconds. She took 90 seconds, but she actually wasn't invited by the DNC. She was invited by Bernie Sanders to nominate him.
Yeah, I want to give it a mixed review. It's absolutely true that they let, the former governor of Ohio, John Kasich, a Republican, and someone who did things like sign laws to allow guns in bars and was a very adamant, pro-life activist. But they let him bait the left wing of the party, which was an absolute absurdity. But at the same time, they really kind of went all in on a lot of this, on a lot of those nights, for Black Lives Matter. And they had an unbelievably galvanizing segment about the imperative to let dreamers stay in the United States. And they had a great segment, about feminism, right? So it was really this attempt to kind of create this big tent. But at the same time, does the highlighting of these Republicans cause such a contradiction that the American people say to themselves, well, what does this party really believe? And it's absolutely scandalous that the younger generation of Democrats, who are, after all, organizing quite effectively to push aside very long-term incumbent congressmen, were slighted.
Rick Perlstein, this last minute we have, and we'll have you back to talk more about Reaganland, but take us back. You have been chronicling the rise of the conservative and Republican Party for decades now, wrote 4 books on it. Take us to Reaganland and the similarities you see, Reagan, Trump, and how Trump has taken it further.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out ways to express these very subtle similarities and differences. And one thing I'll say right now is that Ronald Reagan would definitely say 2 + 2 = 5, right? There's no question about it. But when he would say things like that, it tended to be the off-the-cuff stuff, not the stuff that his speechwriters had written, right? Whereas when Donald Trump takes a podium and he's reading a speech, that's when he lies the most adamantly. And it shows that the kind of lying, deception, propaganda, authoritarianism is qualitatively more systematic than under Ronald Reagan. But at the same time, that it would not have been possible without Ronald Reagan and the movement around him kind of priming the Republican electorate and Republican elected officials for this kind of lawlessness and viciousness.
And you, of course, say that Reagan was one of the most dangerous presidents in U.S. history.
There's no question, right? I mean, whether a guy cuts, 80% out of the public housing budget in 8 years, as Ronald Reagan did with a smile or a scowl, the effect is the same, right? And one of the most dangerous things that Ronald Reagan did as president was something we saw all over in this Republican convention, which is that idea that people who criticize America are not quite Americans, right? That is the Reagan legacy, not only to America, but to the United States. And that's something that is completely unquestioned in the Republican Party.
Well, Rick Perlstein, I want to thank you so much for being with us, author of 4-volume series on the rise of the modern conservative movement. The final book just published, Reaganland, America's Right Turn, 1976 to 80. When we come back, we go to the Gulf Coast. Stay with us. Music by John Carpenter. This is Democracy Now! We're breaking with convention. I'm Amy Goodman as we go to the Gulf Coast, where Hurricane Laura slammed ashore Wednesday as a Category 4 hurricane, the strongest to hit Louisiana in over a century before it was downgraded to a tropical storm, then tropical depression. Laura made landfall south of the city of Lake Charles near the border of Louisiana and Texas. At least 6 people were killed. The Gulf Coast is home to more than half of U.S. refining capacity. And as they shut down ahead of the storm, an analysis by the environmental news outlet Grist showed just 9 of the refineries would produce some 4 million pounds of excess hazardous chemicals. Hurricane Maria arrived 15 years after Hurricane Katrina struck Louisiana and sets a record pace as the 7th named storm to make landfall in the United States so far this year. For more, we're joined by Hilton Kelly, who lives in Port Arthur, Texas, which is about an hour from where the eye of the storm passed, home to the largest oil refinery in the Western Hemisphere, the Motiva refinery. Hilton Kelly, you're facing 5 crises all at once: hurricanes, rising sea levels, air pollution, extreme heat, and COVID. Lay it out for us.
Well, hello. Thank you for having me on the show. Number one, we are dealing with a major issue here on the Gulf Coast, particularly with COVID-19 and pre-existing conditions that many of the citizens are dealing with here. Of course, with all the refineries and chemical plants in our area, there is a large amount of various toxins that are released into the environment, which we live in the Port Arthur, Orange, Beaumont, Lake Charles, and Cameron, Louisiana area.
So talk about the difficulty of the evacuation. You, too, finally evacuated after Noah called you and begged you. Your wife called you and begged you because they were talking about 20-foot storm surges. But if you can talk about the difficulty in a time of COVID, setting up shelters, how people could be protected, even going in the buses.
Well, one of the biggest concerns we had, and also the mayor of Port Arthur, Mayor Thurman Bartee, was the fact that here we are dealing with a disproportionate number of people suffering in the city of Port Arthur and Jefferson County with the COVID-19 virus. I know about 3 people personally that have succumbed to the coronavirus, and it's running rampant throughout not only this country, but also in small towns like Port Arthur, Texas, Beaumont, and Jefferson County. But yet here we are now faced with these major storms as we look down the barrel of Hurricane Laura. And they talked about the surges. You know, everyone was sort of bewildered on how do we deal with this? But the only thing you can do is sort of get buses lined up, and you had people sit in every other seat, which basically took away from those people that were dealing with transportation barriers. But yet at the same time, they had to do something. So they lined up quite a few buses. My wife, she also worked for the Port Arthur Transit, Marie Kelly, and she worked very diligently overtime, under time, and to get people lined up, to get people the information they needed. And they had to work well into about 3 o'clock a.m., 4 o'clock a.m. in the morning, just answering phones to get all the people that needed rides situated, and they still fell short because there wasn't enough transportation because of the situation where they had to separate people.
And of course, you're largely talking about these areas that are overwhelmingly communities of color. Can you talk about the oil industry, the largest refinery in the world there? When you have this kind of hurricane, the combination of the hurricane, the climate crisis, and the extreme heat, and now a fire.
Well, when you add it all up, and to add insult to injury, whenever you have a huge storm coming at a industrial community like Port Arthur, Texas, and the Orange, Texas area, what you find is that many of these industries go into shutdown mode. And whenever they go into shutdown mode, that means they can't process the oil and make all the products that they ordinarily make. And many of the much of the product that's left in the pipeline have to be sent to the flares and actually burned, along with a lot of the gases that build up. So what you see coming off of the smokestacks or the derricks is this huge plumes of black smoke and soot. And much of it is contaminated with benzene, much of it is contaminated with sulfur and other toxins that are not being processed, also volatile organic compounds. And so people are ingesting all of these dangerous toxins, and at the same time dealing with COVID-19 and the extreme heat. It really exacerbates the respiratory system and also the immune system, making us more prone to be affected by COVID-19.
Can you talk about the connection between the climate crisis and environmental racism, Hilton Kelly?
Well, when you look at the fact that we know climate change is real, nowhere is it more prevalent than on the Gulf Coast. What we are seeing is sea level rise. What we're seeing is extreme heat. What we're seeing is a disproportionate number of people dying from cancer. We're seeing a disproportionate number of people dealing with respiratory issues, and also succumbing to respiratory problems like asthma, bronchitis, and COPD. In Port Arthur, Texas, 1 out of every five households have a child or someone behind the doors that have to use a nebulizer to breathe or take breathing treatments. It's time that we do more to assist the world with ending climate change. It's time for the United States to get back into the Paris Agreement. And I think Trump, instead of rolling back some of these Clean Air Act laws and regulations, we should be looking at ways in which we can place more regulations to ensure the safety of our citizens, not only on the Gulf Coast, but across this country. It's time that we stand together, and it's time that all citizens realize that it's up to us to make sure that our environment is safe and clean for all citizens.
Hilton Kelly, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Winner of the Goldman Environmental Prize, Executive Director of the Community and Power and Development Association. Thank you so much. Democracy Now! Produced with Renee Phelps, Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Livy Rainey, Nermeen Sheikh, Maria Taracena, Carla Wills, Tammy Warnoff, Tarina Nadura, Sam Alcoff, Tamarie Astudio, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Massoud, and Adriano Contreras. Our General Manager is Julie Crosby. Special thanks to Becca Staley, Miriam Barnard, Dennis Moynihan, Paul Powell, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Hugh Gran. Stay safe, save lives, wear a mask, and go to our website at democracynow.org for our coverage of the Gulf Coast, for our coverage of the conventions, for our coverage of global issues and the issue of police brutality and the climate crisis.